Copland, what do you, as a composer, owe to Schoenberg?
Well, that's a very good question, I think. I don't think I've ever examined it to the full, in spite of the fact that I realize, not only I, but a great many composers who are never connected, particularly with Schoenberg, do an enormous amount, an enormous amount to his music, and not only to his music, but to his attitudes, his life, the figure that he held in our minds during the last 40 years. I would think that as far as actual technical things go, since I've written 2 or 3 works which I think of as having been primarily started in my mind through thinking about the possibility of the 12-tone method, I would say that technically it interested me primarily in 2 ways. One way was the fact that if you begin with the notion of the 12 tones, the 12 independent tones equal one to the other, you end up by thinking in a different way chordally. In other words, you produce in your mind chords that would not have occurred to you if you were working tonally, so that immediately your whole tonal language becomes refreshed by the fact that you think about chords from a different viewpoint, different standpoint than from the usual one. That was one very important use for me. Another way was the use of the 12 tones without repetition in figuration. I was brought up to think of figuration as being one of those things in music that are just fillers in. You use it to keep going, to fill in the empty spaces. And I never liked the idea of using conventional arpeggio materials and all the accumulated common knowledge, common practice, rather, of hundreds of years of figuration. And the result was that often I did without it in my pieces. It may account in part for the fact that sometimes people say my music is bare because it doesn't have the usual fillers. But when I began working with the 12-tone method, I found that I was suddenly presented with the possibilities of a new kind of figuration, not related to figuration in the past, which changed my attitude toward figuration and made it seem much more possible to use, so that the texture of my music, I would say, written with the use of the 12-tone method, would just have a different sound, I suppose.
Even in terms of that part of your output, which has not directly been influenced by any kind of serial procedure, though, because of that spareness that's characteristic of it, there is a quality of organic growth, a very tight sort of motivic discipline. And as you began your writing career in the 20s, was your early works, in any sense, influenced by that aspect of Schoenberg, which intellectualized the external relations of your work?
Yes, I think that the first work that definitely shows Schoenberg influence is a piece that very few people probably know, though it was published. It was a song that I wrote in 1927, which shows, I use words of E.E. Cummings. It's just called Song to words by E.E. Cummings. But if you look at the harmonies of that song, you'll see that they are derived from thinking about the 12-tone method without in any sense being a dogmatic use of the method. But the real piece that was influenced by Schoenberg, I think, was my piano variations, which date from 1930. There I was confining myself to a very few number of notes. I didn't use all 12 of the chromatic scale. I used fewer, and the harmonies are not quite Schoenbergian in the sense that I was just talking about. Nevertheless, they are very spare, and every single note in the piece can be referred back, both harmonically and melodically, to the material with which I began. In that sense, I think I was influenced by the Schoenberg methods, and also the relationship of the pitch level being standing for the same note no matter in what register you found it. I mean, an A is an A, whether it's at the bottom of the piano or at the top of the piano. That device, curiously enough, I don't think one ever finds, or one rarely finds, in classical music. And I was very aware of Schoenberg doing that, and it was an eye-opener. It helped to make the use of the same material suddenly seem quite different, though you were using literally the same notes. the mere jumping octaves.
The interesting fact about your own output, divided in a sense between the, I may say, quite cerebral works such as the piano variations or even the...
I don't like the word much, but
I don't
go ahead.
But and the music which is, I suppose, to the common ear, a little bit more spontaneous. The one manifesting a good deal more tonal gravity than the other, certainly. As both, you confess to a degree, are influenced by Schoenberg, and as Schoenberg himself was, although fond of saying that one could write music in C major, nevertheless a constant creature of metamorphosis, as he was quick to point out. What is the future of tonality, as well as you can see it, for instance, even in America among the young composers? If the influence of Schoenberg and of the post-Bebenists is as strong as it seems to be at the present time, will his influence cause the ultimate death of tonality?
Well, I would think that was a very tough question to answer intelligently. One could guess, but it would be very difficult to know exactly now what music's going to look like 20 years from now from the standpoint of tonality. You know, the great stumbling block in our minds, those of us who were not in any sense Schoenberg disciples during the heyday of the Viennese school in the 20s and the 30s, the thing we couldn't swallow, really, and that prevented our feeling the same sympathy for his music as we felt with Stravinsky's, was simply that aura of an exaggerated romantic expressiveness which we found in his music, the thing they called expressionism in Germany, and which in the beginning seemed to be an absolutely essential part of the 12-tone method. Now that's where we were fooled. It was from the day that the younger people realized they could use the method and forget about the expressionism side of it that made the whole thing seem possible again. Now it seems to me that the thing that might end to a certain extent this passionate interest in 12-tone methods that is now current would be the need to express things which were not easily expressible through the use of the method. It's perfectly true that it is difficult, as someone said many years ago, to write a folk tune in the 12-tone method. I imagine it is possible, but it isn't easy. It's inconceivable that in the future, with the different kind of life going on, that particular method and the sound that that method makes would be adequate for all situations. So that might, in my mind, be the thing that would make the change. The fact that Mozart followed Bach and not Bach came after Mozart shows that music need not necessarily always become more and more complex. It can easily change its texture in the other direction.
But assuming that growing complexity isn't necessarily synonymous with a readoption of tonality, is tonality in any sense as we've come to know it in the last 350 years likely to be? I'm just asking for a speculative guess.
To go back to where we were, no, I don't think we'll ever do that. That would seem very strange to me.
Good. Talking about Schoenberg as the theorist and Schoenberg as the composer, he himself, as you know, was always greatly offended to be regarded as a theorist, and yet undeniably it's the theorist aspect of Schoenberg that seems to influence most people today. Do you think the intentions of Schoenberg the theorist were well represented by Schoenberg the composer?
I don't think he really wrote about the 12-tone method sufficiently in detail or with at sufficient length to really give me the sense that he fully expressed what it was in his own mind that he thought of when he thought of the whole method and all its implications. I think of his writings as being rather sketchy. Sometimes they seem much more interesting than other times. He was a very curious mentality, it seems to me. Not at all my kind of person, if I were thinking of him purely as a human being. Not a man I would naturally want to spend an evening with. You know, I like someone that more humanist, let's say. He was probably very humanist in his spirit, I'm sure he was. But there was a kind of fanatic thing at the very bottom of his core, which you could not argue with. I remember once meeting him, and either he asked me what I was writing, or in some way it turned out that I had been just writing a ballet. Well, he took a very dim view of ballets. Ballets were not things that interested him and didn't seem a serious art form, and he made no bones about telling me that. Well, that to me just, I knew that I'd hear something like that. I didn't know quite what, but at any rate, it seems to me to typify the man as a man. I don't think of him as a solid citizen who can be followed in everything that he says and does. It isn't necessary that a great man like Schoenberg should be a solid citizen. It's just that if you're going to spend an evening with a man, you sort of don't get anywhere if you can't get the sense you're going to in some way change his thinking. Naturally, you can sit at his feet like a disciple and listen. That would be extremely instructive. But it's not quite the same thing as exchanging an ideas with a reasonable human being.
This would be a very appropriate time to tell the story of the Virgil Thompson column, if you can manage to...
We had, Schoenberg and I, a brief incident which seems rather amusing in retrospect, which I didn't enjoy very much at the time it was happening, because it put me in the position of being anti-Schoenbergian in his mind, which I certainly wasn't. As a matter of fact, I think I was probably one of the first people in the United States to give public lectures on Schoenberg in the mid-20s, public lectures, that is, and I always did my best to present his work as fairly as I could. In fact, I went so far as to play one of the Opus 11 piano pieces. He somehow had the impression during the last years of his life that people were trying to prevent his music from being played. It must have been a very difficult experience to be a man of Schoenberg's gift and his actual production, and to watch conductors year after year programming pieces by men he knew did not have the value of himself, and so in the end it really got under his skin, and he felt that men like Toscanini and Kusevitsky were against him. And it's, for some reason or other, I must have somehow gotten into that crowd of people. At any rate, he thought I was against him, and he wrote a letter that was published in the column that Virgil Thompson wrote each Sunday in the New York Herald Tribune, in which he combined my name with others who were attempting to, as he put it, stop his career or get in the way of his career. So I hastened to write a letter back to the Tribune, pointing out that I wasn't in any sense against his career, that I was an admirer of what he had done, and so forth. And in the end, we did have a personal exchange of letters in which he indicated that someone had been telling him things about me that he was glad to hear were not so. So it had a happy end, but in my mind, it gave me the sense that he must have had a feeling of being persecuted, actually, whether he was in fact persecuted or not. He had that feeling.
Talking about Schoenberg's own frequency on concert programs, or infrequency on concert programs, it's always struck me as a very strange thing indeed that some of the early works, other than Verkleute Nacht, the Kammer Symphonies from Opus 9 and the later one, which was picked up some years later, and Pérez and Mélisande and works of that kind are not more represented. But speaking of his output in general, what would your view be of his position in the repertoire as a substantial part of the repertoire, or otherwise, let's say in the year 2000? Would you have any predictions?
There again, we're in the realm of guesswork. I find it difficult to imagine exactly what the fate of the pieces will be. It's difficult to know how sympathetic people will be to that curious atmosphere that we connect with Vienna of a certain period and a certain school. That music is inconceivable without the life that those men lived in those days. The sense of terror, the sense of being lonely, the sense of being completely different from the classical tradition around themselves, and yet feeling so strongly that they belonged in it and were the natural result of it. All that makes for, from my standpoint, a rather tortured musical expression. And while it's a very powerful kind of tortured expression, it nevertheless seems rather tortured. Now, whether the big public will find it less and less tortured, which would seem normal, because that's what always has happened in the past, I don't know. Certainly when I listen to Wozzeck now, and I think of Wozzeck 35 years ago when I first heard Stokowski do it, it seems like a different piece. It seems much more continuous, much more accessible to everyone. And it's very possible that the same may happen to Schoenberg's pieces, but not to everything. I doubt whether the Woodwind Quintet will ever seem like a jolly little piece that one would want to put on before breakfast every day.
Thank you very much, Mr. Copland. Wonderful. You got some great stuff there.
Yes?
Exactly what I was